The Fabulous Feud of Gilbert and Sullivan by Jonah Winter, illustrated by Richard Egielski. The Fabulous Feud of Gilbert and Sullivan by Jonah Winter, illustrated by Richard Egielski. There was a time when jolly old England was not so jolly. Children worked in factories. Queen Victoria frowned. Everything was grim. Everything was dark, except in the make-believe kingdom of topsy-turvydom. Topsy-turvydom wasn't really a kingdom. It was an opera stage where grown-ups acted silly, and everything got very, very, very confused. Fairies with battery-operated wings got married to stuffy old men in bad wigs. Pirates and policemen sang rousing songs together. Fake ghosts with false mustaches got into polite arguments with living persons. Such was the kingdom of topsy-turvydom. And in this kingdom there were two kings. Well, they weren't really kings. They were two gentlemen, Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Sullivan. You see, they were the ones who wrote these operas. Mr. Gilbert wrote the words in a big dark room filled with things from all over the world. He dreamt up ridiculous stories for the operas. Actually, it was more or less the same ridiculous story for every opera, but set in different places, on a boat, in Italy, in a castle, and yet always the same story. This drove Mr. Sullivan crazy. He wrote the music for these operas, and he longed more than anything to write a serious opera, a grand opera. In his moonlit parlor, he sat at the piano playing beautiful melodies, dreaming of a grand romantic opera. And then the telephone rang. It was Mr. Gilbert. "Mr. Sullivan," said Mr. Gilbert. "Mr. Gilbert," said Mr. Sullivan. "Well, what is it?" "I have a new opera." "No," said Mr. Sullivan, and he slammed down the phone. Uh-oh. Mr. Gilbert was stunned. What sort of way was that for a man to treat his friend? Mr. Sullivan had never acted this way before. Had Mr. Gilbert done something wrong? What about his new opera? Dear, dear, dear. He sat up half the night trying to figure out why his old friend had hung up on him. The next day the sun was shining brightly, but the problem still remained. Mr. Sullivan had behaved very rudely and strangely. It was a mystery to Mr. Gilbert, and he intended to solve it. So he called Mr. Carte, the man who owned the Savoy Theatre. A meeting was arranged. And this meeting did not go well at all. "I refuse to write any more music for Mr. Gilbert's ridiculous operas," said Mr. Sullivan. "It's always the same ridiculous story over and over and over again." "I beg your pardon," cried Mr. Gilbert. "My operas are not ridiculous." "Yes, they are." "No, they aren't." "Yes, they are." "No, they aren't," cried Mr. Gilbert, and with that he left the meeting in a huff. The nerve of Mr. Sullivan, he thought. Well, if that's all the thanks I'm going to get from Mr. Sullivan, then fine. He can just rot as far as I'm concerned. And so it was that the two kings of Topsy-Turvy Kingdom parted ways. Mr. Sullivan took a vacation to France. He ate wonderful food, went to concerts, and did his best to forget about his arguments with Mr. Gilbert. Meanwhile, Mr. Gilbert huffed and puffed and grumbled and mumbled, still angry at how he had been treated. He didn't feel like writing. He didn't feel like doing anything. He never wanted to see Mr. Sullivan again. Well, here was a fine howdy-do. Here was a pretty mess. Here was a state of things. When Mr. Sullivan returned from his trip, he felt exactly the same. No more silly operas. Thank you very much. And yet, in the kingdom of topsy-turvydom, things have a way of getting turned on their heads. Mr. Gilbert missed his old friend, and as time passed, he knew that if they were to write more operas together, he would have to come up with something completely different. One day, out walking through the streets of London, Mr. Gilbert came upon a Japanese street fair. Japan was all the rage in London. Everywhere you went, you saw Japanese fans and Japanese vases. As Mr. Gilbert ambled through the street fair, something caught his eye. It was a Japanese play, and it was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The characters wore colorful silk robes, and their faces were painted white. They strutted around with long swords dangling from their sides. Their facial expressions were rather odd, as were the growling noises they made. Now this was something different. Back home, he sat down at his desk with a blank piece of paper. He sat and sat, trying to think of something Mr. Sullivan would like, an opera that would be nothing like he'd ever written. As he daydreamed, his eyes gazed lazily across the room, then fixed on a single point. A Japanese sword hung on the wall. "Aha!" Mr. Gilbert exclaimed. He took down the sword and held it in his hands. It was quite heavy, and he could barely hold it. And just like that, he knew what his next opera would be about. He set to work at once, writing and writing for days and days. When he had finished the story, he hurried to Mr. Sullivan's house with his manuscript under his arm. It was raining, but Mr. Gilbert didn't care. He couldn't wait to see Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan heard the knock at the door, and he peered out the window at his old friend. Seeing him standing out there in the rain, Mr. Sullivan felt sad. Tears filled his eyes. He rushed to the door. "My good sir," said Mr. Gilbert with a faint smile, "I have something I think you're going to like." Without even removing his hat, he began reading Mr. Sullivan his new opera story. It was set in Japan, of course, and it was called The Mikado, or The Town of Titipu. "I don't think I quite caught that last remark," said Mr. Sullivan, choking back a laugh. Did you say Titipu?" "You are quite correct, sir," said Mr. Gilbert. "Titipu. Titipu. Titipu." The story continued. It was about a cowardly executioner named Coco. And then Coco tricks Naniko Poo into marrying Yum Yum. "I see," said Mr. Sullivan when Mr. Gilbert had finished. He was beaming. Nothing could possibly be more satisfactory. This was a very silly story, and yet Mr. Sullivan loved it. It was new. It was different. There was not a single magic potion in the whole story. This was progress. He set to work on the music right away, and just like that, Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Sullivan were partners once again. As Mr. Sullivan wrote the music, Mr. Gilbert went back home and played with a model theater and little wooden actors and actresses. This is how he figured out how the opera would look and how the characters would move. It may have looked silly, but it worked. Somehow these little wooden figures turned into live human beings, And when the curtain rose on opening night, it was a stunning sight. A stage full of Englishmen dressed up to look Japanese, with white face paint, black wigs, and swords dangling from their sides. It was ridiculous and beautiful. It was completely different. It was the best music Mr. Sullivan had ever written, and the funniest words Mr. Gilbert had ever written. The audience applauded as they never had before, and the two kings of topsy-turvydom took their bows side by side. Could they have gotten here without the arguing? Who knows? Sometimes even the best of friends fight. One thing is for certain, though. Had they not made up, their greatest opera would never have been written. They needed each other. After the Mikado, Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Sullivan went on to write 5 more operas together, and they still fought from time to time. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and like so you don't miss another story. If you have a story you'd like me to read, leave a note in the comment section below.